There is an invisible pattern that separates people who accumulate wealth from those who spend their entire lives chasing it without ever truly reaching it. Andrew Carnegie noticed this long before he became one of the richest men in history. He began his life in extreme poverty. He was born in Scotland, in a simple house, the son of a weaver who lost his job when machines began replacing manual labor. The family barely had enough to eat. When they immigrated to the United States, Carnegie was still a child. He began working very early, first as a worker in a cotton factory and later as a telegraph messenger. But there is something important here. While many people in the same situation accepted reality as something permanent, Carnegie began to observe patterns. He observed how wealthy men thought, how they made decisions, how they talked about money. And it was during this period that he realized something that completely changed his life. Poverty was not just a financial condition. Above all, it was a mental pattern. Carnegie said that many people push money away without realizing it, because they adopt ways of thinking that create an invisible barrier between them and any opportunity for prosperity. That barrier is not in the market. It is not in the economy. It is not in luck. It is in the way a person interprets the world. And here lies the first silent mistake that pushes money away from most people. The belief that money is something external, difficult, and controlled by other people. When someone believes this, they automatically begin to act like a spectator in their own financial life. The person waits for opportunities, waits for luck, waits for someone to open a door. But Carnegie realized something that few people notice. Money does not respond to waiting. It responds to value creation. During his early years working as a messenger, Carnegie developed a habit that most people would never develop. He studied constantly. He read everything he could. He frequented public libraries. He observed businessmen. He analyzed businesses. While many of his colleagues spent their time complaining about working conditions, Carnegie was training his mind to understand how wealth was built. And this reveals an uncomfortable truth. Most people want different financial results, but they maintain exactly the same mental patterns they have always had. They think the same way. They make the same decisions. They react to problems in the same way. And they expect something to change. But Carnegie understood a simple rule. Financial results are direct reflections of the way a person thinks. If thinking does not change, results do not change either. He said there are thoughts that function like wealth repellents. They are ideas that seem harmless, but slowly sabotage any possibility of financial growth. One of these thoughts is extremely common. The idea of absolute security. Many people believe that the financial goal of life is to find something safe. A secure job, a secure salary, a predictable routine. But Carnegie observed something curious about the men who accumulated great fortunes. They were not looking for security. They were looking for expansion. While some people think about protection, others think about growth. And these two mentalities produce completely different results over the years. The obsessive search for security creates defensive behaviors. A person avoids risks, avoids big decisions, avoids responsibility, avoids leadership. And by avoiding all of that, they also avoid the greatest opportunities. Carnegie said that wealth is not born in environments of extreme protection. It is born in environments of creation. Environments where ideas are tested, where problems are solved, where value is multiplied. There is another silent thought that pushes money away from people, and it often appears disguised as humility. The phrase is simple. I just want enough. It sounds like a virtuous statement. But Carnegie warned that many times this phrase hides a deep fear. Fear of responsibility. Fear of judgment. Fear of growth. Because when someone truly decides to grow financially, new demands appear. More decisions. More risks. More leadership. More impact. And many people unconsciously prefer to limit their own dreams in order to avoid these pressures. But Carnegie saw money in a completely different way. For him, money was simply an amplifier. It amplifies character. It amplifies impact. It amplifies influence. If a person has good intentions, resources allow them to accomplish greater things. And it was exactly this vision that led Carnegie to build one of the greatest industrial empires in history. But before all of that, before the steel factories, before the enormous fortunes, before the libraries he funded around the world, there was a mental decision, a silent decision, the decision to never allow small thoughts to govern his vision of the future. And here an important question arises. How many ideas inside your own mind are silently limiting what you believe is possible? Carnegie believed that many people live inside invisible mental boundaries. These boundaries were not created by reality. They were created by repetition. For years, hearing phrases like, "Money is difficult," "Rich people exploit the poor," "If you are born poor, you die poor," "Business is risky," "Entrepreneurship is for a few people." When these ideas are repeated constantly, they stop sounding like opinions and start sounding like facts. And when something appears to be an absolute fact, the mind stops questioning it. But Carnegie did the exact opposite. He questioned everything. He questioned beliefs. He questioned limits. He questioned patterns. He said that one of the most important abilities for anyone who wants to prosper is to develop mental independence, the ability to think for oneself. Because most people are not living according to their own ideas. They are living according to inherited ideas. Ideas from family. Ideas from society. Ideas from their environment. Ideas from people who also never built wealth. And this creates an invisible cycle. People who never built prosperity end up teaching others how money works. But what they are really teaching are only their own limitations. Carnegie observed that almost all great opportunities first appear as something uncertain, something that most people ignore, something that seems small in the beginning. But those who have a mind trained to see value can identify these opportunities before they become obvious. And this explains why some people seem to always be in the right place at the right time. In reality, they are not just in the right place. They have the right mentality. While some see problems, others see possibilities. While some see risks, others see leverage. While some see difficulties, others see hidden doors. But there is one detail that Carnegie emphasized frequently. The human mind has a natural tendency to protect what it already knows. This means that when a new idea appears, especially a big idea, the first reaction of the mind is often rejection. The mind asks, what if it goes wrong? What if I lose money? What if people criticize me? What if I fail? These questions seem prudent. But when they completely dominate the way someone thinks, they create an invisible prison. A prison made of excessive caution. And inside that prison, growth rarely happens. Carnegie said the difference between an ordinary person and an extraordinarily successful one is not only talent or intelligence. It is how they deal with uncertainty. Some people run away from it. Others learn to use it as fuel. And it was exactly this mentality that allowed a poor boy, the son of an unemployed worker, to become one of the greatest builders of wealth the world has ever seen. But his story also reveals something even deeper. Real financial change almost never begins with money. It begins with awareness. The moment when someone realizes that many thoughts that seem natural are actually working against them. When this realization happens, something begins to change. Because the person begins to observe their own mind. They begin to question automatic reactions. They begin to replace old patterns with new ways of thinking. And it is exactly at this point that someone's financial trajectory can begin to transform. Because before any external opportunity appears, an internal transformation must happen. And that transformation begins when a person understands something simple but powerful. While certain thoughts continue to dominate the mind, money will continue to find ways to move away. But the moment those thoughts begin to be replaced with ideas of creation, expansion, and value, something interesting happens. The world begins to look different. Opportunities that were once invisible begin to become clear. Connections that did not exist before begin to appear. Possibilities that once seemed distant begin to move closer. And this change does not happen by magic. It happens because the way you think determines the way you act. And the way you act determines the results that accumulate over time. Carnegie believed that wealth is, to a large extent, the result of mental patterns repeated daily. Small decisions, small choices, small actions, that over the years transform into completely different life trajectories. But there is another extremely common thought that, according to him, acts as a true blocker of prosperity. And this is where many people begin to notice something uncomfortable about their own mindset. Because this thought seems completely logical. It seems prudent. It even seems intelligent. But in practice, it may be silently keeping thousands of people stuck in exactly the same financial place they have been in for years. And that thought begins with a very simple sentence. This sentence appears in the minds of millions of people every single day. When I have more money, I'll start. It sounds reasonable. It sounds prudent. But Andrew Carnegie noticed something extremely curious about this type of thinking. Almost no one who thinks this way actually begins. Because money rarely appears before action. It appears afterward. This reversal of logic traps many people in an invisible cycle. They believe they must first have resources. First, they must have guarantees. First, they must have security. And only then will they be able to act. But Carnegie noticed that the men who created wealth did exactly the opposite. They started before they felt ready. Before they had all the resources. Before they had all the answers. Because they understood a fundamental rule of prosperity. Clarity emerges through movement. While someone remains standing still waiting for perfect conditions, their mind remains trapped in the same doubts. But when a person begins to act, something changes. They learn. They adjust. They make mistakes. They correct. And little by little, they build a capability that cannot be learned through thinking alone. Carnegie used to say that many people spend their entire lives preparing to live. They study possibilities. They plan scenarios. They analyze risks. But they rarely execute. And this creates a dangerous illusion. The illusion of progress without real movement. Because thinking about something is not the same as building something. Planning is not the same as executing. Imagining opportunities is not the same as capturing them. Wealth rarely rewards intention alone. It rewards consistent execution. But there is another, even more subtle mental pattern that Carnegie identified while observing hundreds of entrepreneurs and investors throughout his life. This pattern is related to the way people interpret difficulties. When something goes wrong, two different reactions can appear. Some people immediately conclude that it is a sign they should not have been trying. They interpret the difficulty as a warning that the path is wrong. But other people ask a completely different question. They ask, what is this trying to teach me? This difference may seem small, but over the years it creates completely different life trajectories. The first mentality seeks comfort. The second seeks growth. Carnegie often said that almost every great opportunity comes hidden inside a problem. But most people never see that opportunity. Because when they encounter difficulties, their attention becomes fixed only on the discomfort, on the risk, on the frustration. Meanwhile, people with a mindset trained for prosperity do something different. They analyze the problem. They try to understand its structure. They look for ways to solve it. And by solving problems that others avoid, they create value. And value is the foundation of all lasting wealth. Another silent belief Carnegie frequently observed was the tendency to underestimate one's own potential. Many people grow up hearing ideas that slowly shape their perception of capability. Phrases like, "This is not for people like us. Rich people are different. You need connections. You need to be born into a rich family." Over time, these ideas create a psychological boundary. A person begins to believe that certain levels of prosperity belong to a different group of people, as if there were an invisible division between them and us. But Carnegie knew from personal experience that this division was an illusion. He had lived among poor workers, and later he spent decades among some of the richest men on the planet. And he realized something that would surprise many people. The difference was not extraordinary intelligence. It was not rare talent. It was not supernatural luck. It was mainly the way they thought about possibilities. Men who built great fortunes had one characteristic in common. They deeply believed in the ability to create solutions. When they saw a market, they asked, what can be improved here? When they saw a problem, they asked, how can this be solved more efficiently? When they saw a need, they asked, how can I create something that solves this? Meanwhile, many people train their minds to ask completely different questions. questions that limit action, questions that feed doubt, questions that reinforce fear. Questions like, what if this doesn't work? What if I lose? What if it's too late? What if someone else is already doing it better? These questions sound prudent, but they direct the mind to search for reasons not to act. Carnegie believed that the quality of the questions a person asks determines the direction of their life. Questions focused on fear produce paralysis. Questions focused on creation produce movement. And movement is where opportunities begin to appear. There's also an emotional pattern Carnegie frequently observed in people who remain financially stuck for many years. The habit of comparison. Comparing salaries. Comparing lifestyles. Comparing achievements. Comparing trajectories. At first glance, this seems natural. But constant comparison creates a silent psychological effect. It traps the mind in the present. A person begins measuring their current value against other people instead of focusing on future expansion. Meanwhile, growth-oriented people make a different comparison. They compare who they are today with who they were yesterday. And they ask, am I evolving? Am I learning something new? Am I increasing my ability to create value? This comparison with one's own trajectory creates real progress over time. Carnegie believed that wealth does not arise from isolated great moments. It emerges from a long sequence of small improvements, accumulated learning, progressively better decisions, and above all, the constant construction of capability. The ability to think better, the ability to solve bigger problems, the ability to lead people, the ability to see opportunities before they become obvious. But there is an extremely common mental trap that prevents many people from developing these capabilities. The belief that knowledge alone is enough. Carnegie met many extremely intelligent people. People who knew a lot, who read a lot, who understood complex theories, but who never transformed that knowledge into concrete results. Because there is a fundamental difference between knowing and applying. Knowing can be comfortable. Applying requires exposure. It requires attempts. It requires failures. It requires adjustments. And many people prefer to remain in the safe territory of theory. But Carnegie observed that wealth rarely emerges from theory. It emerges from imperfect application, from trying, from constant adaptation. Another thought that often pushes money away from people is the idea that success must happen quickly. We live in a culture that celebrates immediate results, stories of fast wealth, instant gains, opportunities that promise transformation within a few months. But Carnegie built his empire over decades. Decades of learning, decades of mistakes, decades of adjusting strategies. He understood something that many people forget. Great structures take time to be built. A small tree grows quickly, but a giant tree spends years developing deep roots before reaching great heights. The same happens with lasting wealth. It requires foundations, knowledge, relationships, experience, the ability to make decisions under pressure. And these things do not appear overnight. They are built slowly. But when they finally consolidate, they create an extremely powerful base. Carnegie often said that strategic patience is one of the most underestimated qualities in the world of business. While many give up too early, few remain long enough to harvest the fruits of their own growth. But perhaps one of the deepest observations Carnegie made throughout his life is related to the environment a person chooses to live in. Because thoughts do not arise only inside the mind. They are influenced by the environment, by conversations, by the ideas circulating around, by the expectations of people nearby. If someone spends most of their time in environments where prosperity is viewed with suspicion, criticism, or disbelief, their own mind will begin absorbing those ideas, even without realizing it. And slowly, those ideas begin to shape decisions, reduce ambition, limit vision. But when a person begins exposing themselves to different environments, something interesting happens. They begin to realize that many limitations that once seemed normal were actually just beliefs shared within a certain group. And this realization can be profoundly transformative. Because when someone understands that their mental boundaries are not universal, but merely cultural or social, new possibilities begin to appear. But there is still one final pattern of thinking that Andrew Carnegie considered one of the most dangerous of all. A pattern so common that many people live decades without realizing it is silently sabotaging their relationship with money. And this pattern begins in a very subtle way. It appears when a person begins to believe that wealth is reserved for a few, that there is an invisible limit, that some people can prosper, but others were simply not made for it. And when this idea settles deeply in a mind, something powerful happens, not in the external world, but inside the person. Because the human mind always tries to prove what it believes. If someone believes prosperity is not for them, their decisions begin reflecting that belief. They avoid bigger opportunities. They underestimate their own capabilities. They accept less than they could. And slowly they construct a reality that confirms exactly what they believed from the beginning. But Carnegie believed this was perhaps the greatest illusion of all, because history is full of examples of people who started with absolutely nothing. No money, no connections, no social position, and still managed to build something extraordinary. The difference was almost never the starting point. The difference was the way they thought about the path. And when someone begins to understand this deeply, something inside them begins to change. Because they realize that many of the limits that once seemed so solid were actually just stories repeated for too long. Stories that can be questioned. Stories that can be replaced. Stories that can be rewritten. But there is still one final lesson that Andrew Carnegie repeated constantly. A lesson that, if truly understood, completely changes the way a person sees money, opportunities, and their own future. And that lesson begins with a question that very few people have the courage to ask themselves. This question is simple, but at the same time, deeply uncomfortable. If my financial life continues exactly as it is today for the next 10 years, was that really the best I could have done? Most people avoid this question because it forces real reflection. It forces someone to look at their own habits, at their own decisions, at their own patterns of thinking. Andrew Carnegie used to say that the greatest danger is not temporary poverty. The greatest danger is mental complacency. It is when someone begins to accept their current situation as something permanent. Because the moment the mind accepts a limit as definitive, it stops searching for ways to overcome it. And when that happens, life enters autopilot. The years pass. Opportunities pass. Ideas pass. And before the person realizes it, an entire decade has gone by without significant changes. Carnegie observed something that few people like to admit. Most adults live practically the same life year after year. The same routines, the same habits, the same ways of thinking. And then they wonder why the results never change. But the reality is straightforward. Different results require different patterns, different thoughts, different decisions, different courage. He believed that every financial transformation begins with an internal rupture, a moment when a person decides that they will no longer operate under the same mental limits as before. This rupture is not loud. It does not happen with applause. It happens in silence. In the moment when someone decides to stop accepting certain ideas as absolute truths. Ideas like, "This is not for me. I don't have the ability. It's too late. Other people have advantages." Carnegie believed these phrases are like invisible chains. They do not imprison the body, but they imprison vision. And when vision is limited, actions become limited as well. On the other hand, when a person begins to expand their vision of what is possible, something powerful happens. They begin to notice opportunities that previously passed completely unnoticed. They begin to position themselves differently. They start making bigger decisions. They begin developing skills that once seemed distant. And little by little, almost imperceptibly, their trajectory begins to change. Carnegie also spoke frequently about personal responsibility, a word that often frightens people. Because responsibility means abandoning the idea that external factors are the only causes of the results in one's life. This does not mean ignoring difficulties. It does not mean denying challenges. But it means recognizing something fundamental. Even in difficult environments, there are still decisions each person can make. And those decisions, accumulated over time, have enormous power. Small daily changes may seem insignificant in the short term, but over the years, they transform into completely different life trajectories. Carnegie believed that the human mind works like a kind of magnetic field. It attracts ideas, opportunities, and relationships that align with its dominant way of thinking. When someone is constantly focused on scarcity, fear, and limitation, their attention locks onto evidence that confirms those ideas. But when the mind begins operating in a state of creation, learning, and expansion, it starts to notice paths that previously seemed invisible. This is not magic. It is mental direction. The human mind tends to find what it is searching for. If someone searches for proof that financial growth is impossible, they will find plenty. But if someone searches for examples of people who started from nothing and built something extraordinary, they will also find countless examples. History is full of them. And Carnegie knew this because he himself was one of those examples. But perhaps one of the most important things he understood about wealth is that it does not begin with money. It begins with value. The more value a person is capable of creating, solving, and delivering to the world, the greater the rewards they receive over time. Companies grow because they solve problems. Businesses prosper because they improve people's lives in some way. Innovations emerge because someone looked at a problem everyone could see and found a solution no one had considered. This mentality completely changes the relationship with money. Instead of asking only, "How can I earn more?" a person begins asking, "How can I create more value? What problem can I solve better? What skill can I develop that few people master?" These questions direct the mind toward real growth. And real growth inevitably creates greater financial opportunities. Carnegie also said there is an important difference between desiring wealth and being willing to become the person capable of creating it. Many people desire results, but few are willing to develop the qualities necessary to produce them. Discipline, persistence, curiosity, the courage to make difficult decisions, the ability to continue even when results have not yet appeared. These qualities are not gifts some people are born with. They are developed, trained, built through constant practice. And each small daily decision helps strengthen or weaken those qualities. In the end, the central question that Andrew Carnegie left for anyone who wanted to prosper was extremely direct. It was not a question about money. It was not about business. It was a question about mindset. Are you thinking in a way that brings money closer to you, or in a way that pushes it away? Because as long as certain thoughts dominate the mind, thoughts of scarcity, fear, limitation, and doubt, money will continue to seem distant. But the moment the mind begins to operate in creation, value, expansion, and constant learning, something changes. Not instantly, but inevitably. New ideas begin to appear. New connections emerge. New opportunities begin to make sense. And little by little, what once seemed distant begins to become possible. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson from the story of Andrew Carnegie. It does not matter where someone begins. What truly matters is where that person chooses to think from. Because while the mind remains small, the world will seem small. But the moment the mind begins to expand its possibilities, reality slowly begins to follow that expansion. And it is exactly at that moment that many people realize something surprising. Money was never as far away as it seemed. It was simply waiting for the way of thinking to change first.